While Trump raised his fist before a cheering crowd, hailing tariffs as the sword to resurrect America, the world shifted swiftly, silently, and without looking back. In just 48 hours, America's closest allies turned away without leaving so much as a warning. As Trump branded the trade war a triumph of economic sovereignty, a strategic earthquake was erupting behind his back. Canada and the European Union signed a multi-billion-dollar aluminum deal, not only excluding the United States, but doing so deliberately. This wasn't just about a lost contract. It was a diplomatic slap in the face to Trump's entire trade doctrine. It was the moment the U.S. ceased to be the center of gravity. No speeches were given, but every move made it clear the world had moved on. The move marked more than an economic snub. It signaled a global shift in power. The trade war intended to restore American dominance had instead accelerated America's marginalization. While Trump sought leverage, he created a vacuum, and nations like Canada were ready to fill it. Without fanfare, Canada rerouted exports away from the U.S. and toward Europe and Asia. Ottawa didn't ask for exemptions, they restructured. They didn't retaliate, they realigned. In doing so, they sent an unmistakable message. America is no longer seen as a stable partner. The very policies designed to restore American industry had instead isolated it. Manufacturing slowed, trust collapsed, and global supply chains pivoted. This wasn't just about aluminum, it was about reliability, predictability, and leadership. In the eyes of the world, the U.S., once the anchor of global commerce, had become the wild card. In this trade war, America wasn't defeated by its enemies. It was outmaneuvered by its allies. Canada didn't shout. It didn't negotiate. It made a move so precise it checkmated a superpower mid-trade war without saying a word. When the U.S. slapped a 50% tariff on aluminum, many expected outrage from Ottawa. But Canada didn't engage in diplomatic theatrics. It responded with surgical strategy. Within 48 hours, Canada pledged over $1.1 billion SAD to strengthen its aluminum industry, an investment designed not to retaliate, but to replace. While Washington waited for confrontation, Canada executed redirection. Shipments, once destined for Detroit and Dallas, were quietly rerouted to Brussels and Tokyo. Over 3 million tons of aluminum found new buyers abroad, bypassing American ports entirely. U.S. manufacturers scrambled. Prices surged by 54% within weeks. Production lines halted. Some American companies even had to buy back Canadian aluminum through middlemen and at double the cost. Meanwhile, Canada was building. Ports were modernized. Rail lines expanded. Long-term deals with Europe and Asia were sealed at pre-tariff prices. All while the U.S. economy staggered under the weight of its own unpredictability. Canada's silence wasn't weakness. It was weaponized stability. In the context of the trade war, they didn't fight fire with fire. They used water. And it worked. By the time Washington realized what happened, the global market had already adjusted. Canada had replaced America not just as a supplier, but as a symbol of trust. While Trump tried to build walls with tariffs, Canada laid down rail lines and shipping routes, quietly constructing a world where America was no longer essential. As the trade war deepened, Canada responded not with rage, but with a full-scale industrial shift. The centerpiece, the Saguenay Marine Corridor, transformed into a modern logistics powerhouse. Deepwater ports were expanded, rail systems enhanced, and international cargo routes redefined, cutting America out entirely. It was more than infrastructure, it was strategy. Within months, over 3 million tons of aluminum previously bound for the U.S. were redirected to global markets. Quebec became a new industrial hub for Europe and Asia. From Brussels to Yokohama, demand surged for Canadian aluminum, cheap, fast, and politically stable. Back in the U.S., chaos took hold. Prices skyrocketed. auto and aerospace plants paused. Defense contractors faced shortages. The irony stung. Many U.S. firms were now paying premiums for the same aluminum they once imported tariff-free. This wasn't just economic mismanagement, it was a breakdown in credibility. America's attempt to dominate the market through brute force had backfired. Canada's calm, methodical response reshaped global supply chains in real time. What made the shift irreversible was that it wasn't driven by conflict. Canada didn't wage war, it made itself indispensable. It didn't seek vengeance, it offered certainty. In a trade war meant to reassert U.S. control, Canada quietly emerged as the world's most reliable trade partner. With each port expansion, each international contract, and each strategic alliance, Ottawa didn't just survive the storm, it redirected its path toward global leadership. Trump's tariffs may have sparked the fire, but Canada rebuilt the landscape. Canada didn't fight the trade war on Trump's terms, it rewrote the rules, turning aluminum into a national asset rather than a trade liability. While the U.S. weaponized tariffs, Canada turned inward and reimagined its economic playbook. The Canadian government declared aluminum a strategic national asset, elevating it from a commodity to a pillar of national policy. This wasn't posturing. It was a coordinated state-level response. Industry Minister Melanie Joly publicly denounced the tariffs as illegal, but her real power move came in the form of $10 billion in structured loan funds. These weren't bailouts. They were targeted investments tied to modernization, clean energy integration, and supply chain resilience. Ottawa didn't just protect its industry, it fortified it. Precision import quotas and non-FTA tariffs shielded Canadian markets from global shocks without sparking retaliation. And critically, federal procurement policy was restructured to prioritize domestic aluminum for defense and green tech infrastructure. That meant a guaranteed buyer even during market volatility. While America played economic roulette, Canada built a firewall quietly and methodically. And while U.S. manufacturers flailed in uncertainty, Canadian smelters expanded under a web of policy safeguards. In the trade war, one country tried to dominate with muscle, the other with alignment, and alignment proved more powerful. By institutionalizing aluminum's importance, Canada didn't just survive the moment, it built a strategy for the future. And it worked. The silence before the storm was eerie. Washington, confident and defiant, believed the world would bend under its economic pressure. But far from the White House boardrooms in Brussels, buzzed with urgency terminals in Yokohama, lit up with diverted shipments, and across the Atlantic cranes moved in quiet synchronization. The trade war had ignited something far beyond policy disputes. It had triggered a geopolitical shift, and it was accelerating fast. Inside the Oval Office, Trump grinned over charts and proclamations declaring victory in the trade war. He believed tariffs were the sharp edge of American resurgence. But the ground beneath was already giving way. The world wasn't reacting with outrage, it was reorganizing. When Canada was slapped with a 50% tariff on aluminum, analysts expected retaliation. Maybe legal challenges, perhaps political theatrics. But they were wrong. Canada didn't retaliate. It responded like a chess master setting a trap, quiet, patient, calculated. Within hours, Ottawa initiated a national directive. Not a press conference, not a protest. A blueprint. A plan so well orchestrated that its scale wasn't fully understood until the effects were irreversible. Railways in Saskatchewan lit up with upgrades. Deepwater ports in Quebec suddenly received federal grants. Trade officials landed in Frankfurt and Tokyo not with complaints, but with contracts. The trade war had become a battle of tempo, and Canada took the lead. As aluminum, once flowing into Chicago, rerouted toward Hamburg, the U.S. industrial sector began to feel the tremors. Car manufacturers faced delays. Aerospace assembly lines stalled. At Lockheed Martin, a critical shipment of aluminum failed to arrive, held up not by Canada, but by the new global supply chain that no longer prioritized the United States. And yet Washington remained oblivious. "They'll come back," Trump assured his advisors. "They need us." But that belief was rooted in a world that no longer existed. Canada had built something bigger than a trade response. It had built a new identity, the world's most dependable supplier. Investors took notice. Billion-dollar ventures flowed into Canadian smelting towns. Hedge funds pivoted away from U.S. industrials and into Canadian infrastructure ETFs. The U.S. had weaponized tariffs, but Canada had weaponized credibility. At the G7 summit that year, leaders arrived with polite smiles, but their handshakes held secrets. Behind closed doors, German and Japanese officials celebrated a new aluminum partnership with Canada, not America. Even allies like France, long tethered to U.S. interests, began drafting trade roadmaps that excluded the stars and stripes. This wasn't just a trade war anymore, it was a reshuffling of alliances. Back in the States, chaos metastasized. Detroit's union bosses issued warnings. Stock prices of key manufacturing firms plummeted. Small suppliers in Ohio shuddered, unable to meet the new costs. Whispers turned to headlines. Is America losing the trade war tariffs? Backfire. Still, the administration doubled down. Short-term pain for long-term gain, they claimed. But there was no long-term plan, only a long-term void. Meanwhile, Canada was executing. The Saguenay Marine Corridor, once a sleepy industrial strip, pulsed with energy. Autonomous cranes unloaded ships at record speed. Rail hubs mapped directly to Asian cargo routes. Supply chains moved like clockwork. The world was watching and signing on. South Korea inked a 10-year aluminum import deal. The UK bypassed traditional U.S. sourcing entirely. Even Mexico, under pressure from U.S. negotiators, quietly expanded aluminum purchases from Quebec. Trump's trade war, designed to showcase strength, had instead exposed fragility. And then came the moment of collapse. A major U.S. defense contractor reliant on Canadian aluminum declared emergency procurement. They were forced to buy their old supply, now rebranded, rerouted, and twice the price. Congress held hearings. Industry leaders testified not in anger, but in confusion. "We didn't lose a battle," one CEO stated. "We were left behind." That was the real casualty of the trade war, not just missed profits, but lost trust. As factories shut their doors and workers protested in the heartland, Canada continued forward, not gloating, but building. The aluminum that once flowed freely into the U.S. now powered high-speed trains in Asia, armored vehicles in Europe, and skyscrapers in the Middle East. America had once been the axis of trade. Now it was the variable. The final blow came not with noise, but with silence. A global supply chain conference in Geneva ended with a historic announcement: a multinational aluminum consortium anchored by Canada would standardize pricing, ensure climate compliance, and regulate volume, excluding U.S. influence entirely. It was the kind of decision once made only with Washington's blessing. Now it happened without an invitation. In the aftermath, Trump still claimed victory, but his own advisors knew the truth. The trade war wasn't a win. It was a warning when America failed to heed. And as the dust settled, a new reality took shape. Trust is the true currency of global trade. And in this war, the quiet strategist won. When the United States launched its aggressive tariff policies under the Trump administration, the objective was clear: reassert economic dominance and rebalance trade deficits. The move was framed as a patriotic act, a necessary trade war, to protect American industry from decades of globalization. However, what unfolded was a rapid unraveling of trust and cooperation that had long defined U.S. economic alliances. President Trump stood before rally crowds declaring the trade war a fight for economic sovereignty. He believed that tariffs were tools of strength capable of coercing allies and rivals alike into compliance. But while the rhetoric soared, the consequences unfolded quietly and swiftly behind the scenes. The world did not react with protest, they responded with distance. Within 48 hours of the aluminum tariffs, longtime allies like Canada and the European Union made a striking pivot. They signed a multi-billion-dollar aluminum deal that completely bypassed the United States. The speed and precision of the agreement were no coincidence. It was a calculated maneuver that signaled a shift in loyalty and strategy. For the first time in decades, America was excluded from the economic table it had once dominated. This was not just a policy disagreement. It was a symbolic rejection of unpredictability. The trade war intended to project power instead exposed vulnerability. The U.S. expected resistance. What it got was realignment. While Washington framed itself as a fortress, other nations built bridges toward each other. Thus, the trade war did not just initiate economic conflict. It marked the beginning of America's diminishing influence in global trade partnerships. As the trade war deepened, a chilling realization began to dawn on Washington's elite. The battlefield had shifted, and they were no longer in control of the terrain. What was launched as a bold campaign to reclaim American manufacturing had spiraled into a diplomatic debacle. Nations that once deferred to the United States were now executing strategies with surgical precision without asking permission, without giving notice, and most alarmingly, without looking back. Canada's response was subtle but devastating. Ottawa didn't raise its voice, it raised its standards. It didn't counterattack, it restructured. Government officials, CEOs, and logistical masterminds coordinated in silence, turning the aluminum crisis into an opportunity for reinvention. The country had no need to announce retaliation when it was too busy building resilience. While American factories were halting production lines and laying off workers, Canadian ports were expanding. Every crane that swung into motion, every rail line extended toward coastal terminals was a quiet act of defiance in the trade war. These weren't war cries, they were victories measured in contracts, tonnage, and trust. By the time the U.S. noticed it was too late, global companies had shifted. Logistics firms rewrote their routes. Asia, Europe, and even South America now looked to Canada as their preferred partner. Not because Canada was cheaper, but because Canada was stable, predictable, calm. Everything America had ceased to be. Inside the Pentagon, defense procurement officers scrambled. The price of aircraft-grade aluminum had nearly doubled. Shipbuilders faced unexpected shortages. Domestic mills couldn't meet demand. Ironically, the U.S. military found itself at the mercy of the very nation it tried to punish. At congressional hearings, executives testified not just to economic pain, but to betrayal. "We trusted in protectionism," said one aerospace CEO. "Instead, we got isolation." Senators grilled trade officials demanding explanations. But the real answers were not in Washington. They were in Saguenay, in Vancouver, and Quebec, where Canadian supply chains now hummed with international demand. The aluminum wasn't just flowing, it was thriving. And Canada wasn't finished. In a landmark move, Canada classified aluminum as a strategic national asset. It was no longer just a commodity, it was a cornerstone of policy. This allowed the government to funnel billions into clean tech smelting upgrades, secure long-term procurement contracts, and embed aluminum into national infrastructure projects. It was protectionism done with elegance. Meanwhile, the U.S. faltered. The strategy that was supposed to bring industry home had instead fractured alliances,